There's a long period of years between the work I did with you yesterday and the work that I'm going to do with you today. And I've done something that is either spirit-led or foolish. Because I listened yesterday, and if I heard correctly, I heard, certainly in our British, was it English group that did the dancing? Mm-hmm. In that European. Oh yes! What's Europe? How could that have slipped my mind? But I heard some pain. I heard some pain among the tertiaries. They were talking about it had been a very rocky time. And I've heard a couple of other things in the day. And it actually, well, as I say, you can judge. It's either the spirit or madness. So I decided that instead of starting with this, which is what I was going to do, this is very personal, and anyone from my order who is watching, if they throw me out, can I join with tertiary? But don't let them hear that. Would you consider having me? Okay, I had 3 years in national office, but not as minister. My first 3 years was as national formator. That was way back before some of you were born. That was 1999 to 2002. My own personal story is that due to very bizarre and difficult family circumstances, I had been a school teacher. I had to give up teaching, and I was on my knees but not praying. And at that time, I had been professed into the TSSF, Third Order of St. Francis. And we had become OFS. At that time, we were SFO, but now we've gone international. So it's Ordo Franciscanus Secularis, and this is what we call ourselves, OFS. But we were SFO, so that was Secret Franciscan Order, and what is it, the fraud agency? So something like that. Anyway, we had children. I'd been going to the meetings, but we'd moved, and I got back into going to the fraternity, which was Canterbury. It was a founding fraternity from the Fisk International Centre. And I had discovered the new rule. So we're talking here early 90s. I loved it. And it really gave me a hunger to find out more. But in fact, although the rule is dated 78, I can tell you that we actually got the constitutions in 2000. There was a 10-year look at the rule, look at the constitutions and work on them. So I'm talking about after the first 10 years. Did we know in the early 80s that we were not TUSF? No. It took a while to percolate. But when it did, I became, in fact, it gave me something to hold on to at a time when life was difficult. But that isn't the point. But I thought, okay, what can I do with my life? And I trotted up to the study centre, which then had a conventual principal called Jarlath. And I went into Jarlath on my knees, not praying, and I said to him, I'm really not sure what to do with my life, but the centre is here, could I do some courses? Are you doing anything on the new rule of the order? And Jarlath looked at me and said, Paula, you're going to give the Franciscans more than you can ever imagine. Do any course for free. And that's what I did. So that takes us to 1997. So I did my initial studies 1997 to 1999. And all that while I'm trying to work on the rule, and I've become formation minister. And boy, is it miserable. What was TSSF? You met, called by the friars, you had a monthly meeting. The monthly meeting was prayerful. The monthly meeting was an extra homily. And it took you a year to attend that and become a member of the order. And that was it. And it was lovely. What really brought me to all of this personal story is I think now that I've been in formation and realized how difficult it is to move members, many of whom are aging, from the TSSF model. The whole idea behind the new rule for the seculars was that we would be autonomous. We're no longer a third order under church canon law. We are beautifully called a PAF, a Public Association of the Faithful, because we no longer, when I was, it was unusual because we had both OFM and conventual. So usually you would have been part of an OFM, friary would have called you in for the meetings, but with the centre there were two, so we were under two. The Capuchins weren't living at the centre at the time. And people do not want to change. I've said that in 1999, I'm saying that now. So when I heard this about tension, now the tension also was from the First Order, because they were saying, we don't need you. We were saying to them, we don't need you, what is our role? So instead of having, now this is me speaking today, possibly because of my experience, possibly because I've had a bit of time to be away from everything and just come back to what I love in the Franciscan whole story and all that I know and do. But this very sad, very difficult period. And when I heard about tensions, I thought, okay, I'm not going to start with what I thought I'd start. I'll start with where I feel we are. Having been then for 6 years in national office, which meant that I went to international because I was representing GB there. And we're finding very, very much some of the same problems. I think it is, for me, there is an awful lot of material. There is endless formation material. There are endless books. And all of them are trying to be commentaries to help us to understand the rule better. But for me, we actually haven't managed to just breathe, relax, be. What I think we will be, I believe we will be, maybe not in my lifetime. So I think the relationship with the First Order has greatly improved. But of course, in our situation, the First Order is shrinking in numbers. When I first started, obviously we had a friar because they ran the meeting. That continued, we were at the centre. We could have friars at our meetings, really, every meeting, there was no problem at all. Now, it's difficult to get a friar to do a profession. It's difficult to get a friar to be present when you need, in fact, you have what's the ability to delegate. So normally you would have a friar present who would actually be the witness of the church in effect. Because what's happening is internal. You are professed within the order to members. So in a sense, the friar's job is to observe and represent the church. But of course that can be done by sisters. That can be done by a local cleric. Doesn't need to be a friar. But that has caused huge tension. Friars want to be at every profession. Members want to be professed with a friar. So I don't know if that was the spirit or not, but I felt I wanted to share with you the struggles that I think we are having. I think a major struggle that we have is we are autonomous. So that means that we are totally self-sufficient. So we don't have any money given to us by anybody else. So we have to fund anything that we do. And I think because most members are not white and not from Europe or North America, most are South America, Africa, particularly, growing in huge numbers. If you want to put on an international event, you have to fund it. And so the richer countries, there's a sort of tariff. If you're from a richer country, you give so much ahead to international. If you're a poorer country, you give so much ahead. And so we have a common purse. But with all the other things that we have to consider, such as ecology, flying, you must feel the same, people traveling at this time. But yet we all know the value of having these gatherings and how good it is to be able to mix and meet people who are Franciscans. And so basically, I just thought I'd start to say, I don't think we're there. I think we're making good progress. I think there's a much better relationship with the friars. We have at international level, we have a TOR, OFM, OFM CAP, and OFM conventual. They are sort of international spiritual assistants, and they are part of the oversight of the order. We come under the Curia fundamentally, but basically that, and also there is a TOR sister who is representing TOR. So there's a sort of sixth person, including our Minister General, who would be kind of central. Then we have international chapters where we elect international, so your provincials, we would be electing councillors with areas for special different reasons. So like we have 2 for Africa, English-speaking Africa, French-speaking Africa. And there is South America also takes in Portugal and Spain for language. And so we fairly recently redesigned what we do at international, but that's an international chapter. Only the International Minister General has a 6-year term. Everybody else is a 3-year term. So our current Tibor is our current Minister General. He was re-elected, so he will probably go for 12 years, and mostly that happens. But there has to be an international chapter as an interim, because international can take decisions. We have an emergency fund. The one I remember very well is Haiti. So that's when I was in international, new things were happening. And there was a decision taken to send money and to send members of the order to help. Now that wasn't approved. The international took that decision, and then they had to come to an international chapter and explain what they'd done. So they'd done it, they had carried it out, but they had to, it was subject to us to, I mean, we couldn't undo what was done, but basically that's a kind of priority or a purse that is held that can be used for any international emergency. So I don't know, might be more confusing, but I don't know if that gives you some of the flavour. We're trying to do a lot. And I sometimes think we're just not ready yet. And I think as the friars and sisters in our part of the world decrease in numbers, that's a terrible loss to us. But again, I felt a little bit in Europe last night, this sense that they need to turn to us. We have to see ourselves more as collaborating with them. And it is very, very, I mean, one of the things I've been asked to do in my role now is actually to look at this handing over, which is in our constitutions and in our rule. If a friar can't be present, therefore you can delegate. So what I'm doing at the moment is preparing a sort of instructions. What do people need to know? How would you do it? And of course, that's sensitive. People don't want it. So, spirit or not, that's where I've begun. And that's where I feel we are. So as I take you through other things, that's Paula. I love the new rule. I love the goal. And I love the fact that, you know, we have gone, we're much, much more, I suppose, as TOR, we've had to grow up. Not TOR, OFS. We've had to grow up. We've had to take responsibility. But I will still hear, well, I was at a meeting on Sunday. It was a lovely meeting on Sunday because in our own fraternity, we have now, instead of the go along and listen to the friar and become professed in 12 months, we have a very stringent program in the UK. There is flexibility. You can nationally decide your formation, and as long as it's improved internationally, that's okay. We have a 3-year program. So you come to visit the fraternity for 6 times. That might mean you go to an event, but you come and you're a visitor. Don't make any decision at all. And then you enter what's called inquiry. And inquiry is 6 months when you learn more about the order to help you discern. Do you think you want to go further and become a candidate? So this inquiry period is a minimum of 6 months. And the 2 members on Sunday were being admitted to the inquiry. Now that would never involve a friar, because you're inviting somebody to come into your fraternity. And it's a fraternity that you're working with. It would be lovely when there were friars there, but that just isn't the case. Then the next stage, if they go through that, will be candidacy. And again, this is becoming personal, and I hope you don't mind, but I've just been to a CC. And when I was at a CC with a group of 24 people, there was a lovely young lady, 42, called Lorraine. Lorraine had been a drug addict. Lorraine had had huge alcohol problems. She has 2 young children. She's an isolate because she lives in Jersey, and we don't have, there are SSF, she has some contact with TSSF, but there is no one, so she's working on Zoom. And she came to this week with Franciscans, not all Franciscans, because I don't bring just Franciscans, but mainly Franciscans. And she spoke to me quite early on and said, could she have a chat to me? I said, of course she can, Lorraine. As the week progressed, she didn't know that, need that. She felt embraced, she felt part of fraternity. And she said, we were at the Verna on the Wednesday, we were finishing on Friday. And she came up to me and my husband at the Verna and said, Paula, I want, because you still write a personal letter. If you want to go into candidacy, you write a personal letter and the council will decide if they're going to let you go forward. So she said, Paula, are there any trees here at the Verna where I could go and write a letter? I said, yes. Once you go through this wall, there's nothing but trees. And she sat and wrote her letter. And then on Thursday night, which was our last time together, we had mass in the Basilica in the morning. So we're just having a gathering and prayer. And Brother John Capuchin, who was with us, was there. Had never actually been at a camp, didn't really know what was happening. She became a candidate. So she was welcomed by the fraternity to which she'll join. She was welcomed by all of us, and it was very powerful. And John said, right, yeah, I do these many years, but she's done 5 years. And it was a very touching. So that's, I think, basically all the changes we're making are good. But I think it was like we tried to run before we could walk. And we took the autonomy, the independence, the autonomy, and tried to work with it. And I think the financial problem is genuine. I actually think it's very hard to fund an international order where the wealthiest people are in the minority and are paying substantially less, as it should be. No problem with that at all. But I think it is a genuine, to be autonomous. Yes, our rule is approved by the church, but fundamentally, and we will call on brothers or sisters, I've asked sisters as well, someone Franciscan independent, if you have an issue, if something's gone wrong, and you want an independent person to be present, as you have, because we have in our constitutions, if you have problems to resolve, one of the ways you do it is outside of the meeting. And you will meet with somebody, maybe the minister, maybe formation, depends on what's happening. You will meet with somebody else. And that person will kind of summarize what's been happening. And for me, the sisters have been very, very forthcoming in situations like that. So anyway, that's where I feel we are. I am very, very attached to our role under constitutions, and I think it is the right way to go forward. But I think, as I say, just listening to tensions and feeling, yes, I am very content, and I'm content to be in the position I am. I've called myself elder because people come to me for all sorts of things, and I'm not in, I mean, I'm regional formator, that's my responsibility. But things like preparing this document for helping people to be assistants who are not Franciscan, doing that with sensitivity, and I feel quite happy, and I feel what I do is always going to be subject to other people. I'm only doing what I do, and I'm presenting it, but I'm not making the decisions, and I don't have any ownership or direct responsibility. So for what it's worth, that's where I'm starting. I'll go on to TOR rule now, and then I'll go back to our rule. But with so what happened? Vatican Council II asked religious to go back to their founder, to find out more about their founder. And I remember Margaret Carney telling us that there are hundreds of Franciscan communities today, but there were eons of people, congregations who had Franciscan in their name. And one of the things I said in America was actually getting people who had Franciscan in their name to ask, do you want to be Franciscan? Because remember I said to you that from the earliest days, having supramontem, having memoriale propositi, meant that other groups could take that because that gave them legitimacy within the church. So lots of communities would have built up with a Franciscan rule that may not be Franciscan at all. And she said that was very, very difficult. So people had to, communities had to reach a decision. Do we want to have this Franciscan connection? And then they had a series of, so this is, it took a long time. I mean, our rule is 78, their rule is 82. So what they did was they sent off to various parts of the world, and it's still true. I said before that we have very few international languages, really. You know, we have European languages. We don't actually have Chinese or many other, Portuguese we don't even have, which the Portuguese are very annoyed about because they think there are more speaking Portuguese and Spanish. So we're still a very Western, Latin in some ways. And that's, you know, so if you are living in another place, your role is to translate it in your province. So there will be translations made, but official translations are only in 4 languages. So basically, what the TOR were able to do was to send communities information. Unlike us, we really did not know that we were changing, but the TOR did. And where the feedback came was really from Dutch, French, Brussels. So you can see very much European groups. And they worked together. Each group would prepare a draft. So they were supposed to do like we did. You had 10 years, you were supposed to circulate all the communities and come back with suggestions for the rule. Eventually that led to something called the Madrid document. The Madrid document was 1974. And then 5 years later in the USA, there is another document, Go to My Brethren. Now what they discovered isn't surprising. There were some that wanted the rule to be very much as I told you about in the Memoriale Propositi. Very much fast, abstinence, clothing, all of that stuff. That was the content of really all of our rules, TOR and OFS, up until the changes that we had. Yeah?
Sorry, Paula, I wonder if you might explain the difference between TOR and
Oh, I'm so sorry, I haven't. Third order regular. So third order regular are Franciscans living in community who are not second order. Second order are the Poor Clares and Collatines and other groups. And I'm not sure if there are any male or not. I don't like to say there aren't because there may be male contemplative Franciscans that are not just living in hermitages, but I don't know that.
I think the Friars of the Atonement probably are.
But they don't come.
Oh, right, okay, sorry.
Come on, one thing at a time here,
Okay,
but
sorry.
remind me. So third order regular. Regular means that you have a rule. We have a rule. But this is regular, this rule, which the first one was 1517. The first rule, so we shared a rule until 1517. The TOR are living in community. And it could be an individual community or it could be a federation. Federation is still used when people who are sharing the same ideas decide they want to join with others. So you would get a congregation, I suppose, the same idea, where you'd have several different convents or whatever they're living in. Today, not all Franciscan TOR people are able to live in community in a house that is just for them. Some of them are connected with their communities, but they live in a flat, they work, and they meet when they can. But ideally, they would have been living in separate communities. So that's TOR. And some male Franciscans did not want to be first order. And so they are the male TOR branch. There are hundreds of TOR sisters. We don't have a TOR group in the UK. There are certainly in America, and there are in many parts of the world. But TOR, OFM, the three OFMs, are recognized universally. That's the difference. So they can be called upon, they're called upon by the Curia, they have to take responsibility for us. So we have to have a TOR, OFM, three OFMs present with us. But for us, the atonement groups like that are independent of the universal global, right? And they will have to go, like any other congregation, they would have to go to the bishop, get approval to set up. So the TOR males were just men who did not want to live or be part of the first order. So 4 of them, and this is the rule for TOR. Their first rule was 1517. They had another rule in 1927, but the only reason for the 1927 rule is that the first time that the church really tried to put the orders, classify them and put them together, so that it was a codification. But basically TOR live in small groups in community, and they all developed they would have had supramonte, they'd have had the Franciscan rule. Nearly every community that I know of will have its own statutes. It'll have the rule, but it will have constitutions and statutes that are for your country. So for example, our 3-year program minimum in other countries might be 18 months. But because we have decided as a national fraternity 3 years is right, we can do that. It was the same for the TOR congregations. So they would modify it, but the rule would apply to all of them. So in 1920, so the problem with, there were several problems with the whole idea of community, especially for women. Throughout the period we're talking about, which was massive, but basically women were not supposed to be other than married or in a convent. They were not supposed to say they profess poverty, because then they would be dependent on other people. So basically, married or in a convent. I think the best escape from that were the beguines. Do any of you know what a beguinages are? So the beguinages were places where women could live safely. Sometimes they'd be in community, especially younger women with children. There might be schools, they would have a priest, they would have maybe a bit like a little village, and they would be able to work independently and earn money. They were, even some of them were accused of heresy, but basically that was the best place. And I think that's what Claire did when she went to Benedictine monastery first. Then we know she's in this little place, and I think that's a beguinage. And then she comes and starts the order of San Damiano. So basically, that cloisterization, that seeking to avoid heresy, I think one of the biggest problems the church has had has been building walls and entrenchment. So you've got the Reformation, oh dear, let's build a wall. Well, what's a cloister? You're safe in there. You can't be heretics. We'll make sure you're okay. I think, honestly, I think that's, I'm only speaking for our church, but how do you react? You build a barrier, you go behind it, and you don't take the risks. So basically this, the TOR, the restriction made on them, in addition to the fact that women always had to be cloistered, was that they must be subject to OFM. So they'd have an OFM visitor. Now, that leads to problems throughout history. Sometimes people want it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the friars want it, sometimes they don't. But basically, that was the 1527. It was very much similar to the rules that we've looked at, so to do with all the things that I've said, but they were definitely recognized as Franciscan. The rule was for people living in community, not living in their homes, and they were subject to OFM. So that's basically TOR. Then when we get this invitation, it took 69, so it took it to 69 to suggest what happens. Then 10 years when the drafts are being produced. Then in 10 years later, there is both a supervisory group and an organizational team were formed, and they will meet in 1980, and they will continue meeting between 1980 and 1982, and their rule is approved in 1982. All of them have their constitutions. All of them have their statutes. So if you belong to the Franciscan Mysteries of St. Joseph, you will have your own rules that apply to you. So what were they looking for? They wanted to find a common rule. How on earth do you find a common rule? And so what emerged, initially you had very, very different, these three, Dutch, French, and Brussels, they were totally different. Some would be very much going back to monastic. Some would be, it's a bit like the trouble that the friars had in the 1st century. Or they would basically want to go much more free. So there was a huge disparity. But they got together, and this intense period of 2 years, it emerged that it was agreed to find 4 fundamental values. So this is what they decided was to be the fundamental values in it. There's one missing. You might like to suggest?
Humility.
Well, yes, it could be, but in this, that would be covered by minority poverty. What do we belong to as well as the order? Or fraternity. And the reason they didn't, they argued about that, but the reason they ended said, but we are fraternity by definition. We are always in fraternity, so it wasn't necessary to add it to the fundamental values, but that was a matter of dispute that they had. So what they also decided was that, so what they said about fraternity community is regarded not as a value, but as a social reality of committed relationships in which we live out our gospel witness. So they make a distinction between value and what they call the social reality of committed relationships. The other decision they made is that the TOR rule is now mainly the words of St. Francis. It will also go back to some Franciscan sources. It will also have scripture. But what you have is very much what I said there. Those words, scripture, very little of it is not that. The rule is largely in the words of St. Francis, easily accessible as a result of many years of Franciscan scholarship. It's a spiritual document, not a set of rules and regulations. The TOR Franciscans claim to follow the gospel in the spirit of Francis as he first shared it with the townspeople of Assisi. The specific charism of our third order is continuous conversion. So where you have metanoia conversion, that would kind of be like underpinning everything. So although you have 4 fundamental values, they would basically say that it is metanoia that underpins this Franciscan one. So for Francis, biblical metanoia has 3 elements: acknowledge God in creation, in God's goodness, and in the ministry of Jesus. Adore God with whole life, prayerfully, in purity of heart, poverty and obedience, and serve God as Jesus taught. So acknowledge God in creation, in his goodness, in the ministry of Jesus. Adore God with a whole life, prayerfully, in purity of heart, poverty and obedience, serve God as Jesus taught. Very much Franciscan, we find that. So nothing, but that's how they saw metanoia. As a community, living in obedience for fraternal, communal life. They live in faith to faith, to Christ and the gospel. So their obedience in their life to faith, to Christ, to the gospel, to the church, to the minister, and to one another. And obedience kind of undergirds fraternal and communal life. Formation. Formation is constant. It is lifelong. But it is, and I think I agree that this is what it is. In your own formation, what you are trying always to say is, what is my project? What is the call God has for me? And in my own position, moving to Norwich, not being enough, so what am I to do? Not my plans. My plans were changed. So this sort of sense that you're always looking, what is God? What is my vocation? What is my project? As an individual, but also in fraternity. So what is the community seeking to do? Again, metanoia, seeking radical and complete self-giving to God in this way of life. So these are all constant. These are things that you are trying to work for throughout life. Countercultural. Dress, all it says about dress is simple. And it also says to live a simple way of life. The commitment is to fraternal life without attachment in living poverty, with the minister at the heart of the community. So TOR members will have work, that have worked to earn money. The money goes to the community. So basically, all of their money is common. It's a common purse. And again, they have their elections and they have their new officers appointed I think it's 3 years. This life leads to chaste union with Jesus Christ through the Spirit. The community's work manifests God's love for neighbor. So it's this thing about witness and this thing about living in chastity and living in community. Seeing that as deepening the fraternity and as making sure that your main emphasis is on your mission and your life with Christ through the Spirit. Now, what I've done for this little section is I'm actually going to give you the whole section on the spirit of prayer, but I'm also just going to give you a little commentary on it first, just to give you an idea of how short this document is. So behind the spirit of prayer, what they initially came out with was the purpose of all this isn't the rule, right? This is looking at what it should mean. The purpose of all Franciscan prayer is to give God ceaseless praise and thanksgiving for all God has done and us in creation. Franciscan contemplative prayer is Trinitarian, is incarnational, it embraces all creation. Those are big givens. The created world is the expression of God's goodness and the theatre of God's redemptive love for us. Because we are made in God's image, it is possible to seek union with God as we do God's will. The Franciscan does not flee the world in order to escape God, but seeks immersion in its sacramental reality. These are huge. They're thinking about, but you can recognize the Franciscan in this. The gospel should be in all hearts, and communities seek to approach the sacrament with humility and reverence. Brothers and sisters seek ever more to be transformed into Christ, crucified because of love for us. Practical acts of contrition and penance lead to a simplification of life in a spirit of humility. And I think we're talking about in contrition. If you're in community, and there will be problems, and you share and you confess, if you like, it does in the end lead to a simplification. Certainly leads to humility, but you're not getting bogged down by matters that could be resolved. Well, if not resolved, you respectfully differ, but it's not taking away from the unity of the community. A life of chastity is designed to help consecrate the innermost self to God. Now then, I've just done this because I couldn't do what I wanted, which was go to the documents and put them out for you because I was frustrated yesterday. But what I decided to do was just to give you, as they appear, in the very short extract we're going to see next, look at all the sources that are Franciscan. So we have the earlier rule several times, we have the Canticle of Creation, we have the second letter to faithful, the later admonition and exhortation, we have the Epord, which is the letter to the clergy. So those are all taken from Franciscan sources, and it continues. Again, the letter to clergy, the Testament, the admonitions, again, the later admonition, exhortation, admonition, earlier rule. So this is kind of the skeleton on which that rule lasts. Now, what it actually says, the spirit of prayer, so this is the rule. This is the section on prayer in their rule. Everywhere and in each place and in every season and each day, the brothers and sisters are to have a true and humble faith. From the depths of their inner life, let them love, honor, adore, serve, praise, bless, and glorify our most high and eternal God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In a nutshell, Trinitarian, Franciscan, all those words that we hear in the praise, Francis in the prayers of Francis. The sisters and brothers whom the Lord has called to the life of contemplation, so these would be people who are living more contemplative lives, So you have, even in the UFS, we have groups of people who have consecrated their lives to God, and they will form their own fraternities, in addition to belonging to the order itself. So if a TOR group is more contemplative, they, with daily renewed joy, should manifest their special dedication to God and celebrate the Father's love for the world. It was He who created and redeemed us, and by His mercy alone shall save us. Since the sisters and brothers are to be totally conformed to the gospel, they should reflect and keep in their hearts the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is the word of the Father, as well as the words of the Holy Spirit, which are spirit and life. And you've got that in the admonition, exhortation, in the prologue to the letter as well. Let them participate in the sacrifice of our Lord Jesus Christ and receive his body and blood with great humility and reverence, remembering the words of the Lord. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life. Moreover, they are to show the greatest possible reverence and honor for the most sacred name, written words, most holy body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom all things in heaven and on earth have been brought to peace and reconciliation with the mighty God. That could just be words of Francis. Whenever they commit sin, the brothers and sisters without delay are to do penance interiorly by sincere sorrow. So you're not going, at that stage, you're just reflecting on what you've done. Exteriorly, by confessing their sins to a priest. They should also do worthy deeds that manifest their repentance. They should fast and always strive to be simple and humble, especially before God. They should desire nothing else but our Saviour, who offered himself in his own blood as a sacrifice on the altar of the cross for our sins, giving us examples so we might follow in his footsteps. That's directly from Francis. So it's not saying that you only fast if you sinned. There is a lot in each of these. Fasting, it's up to you. It's as you choose to do it. Some will do more than others. So that is all says, that is the whole section of the rule on prayer. So does that give you some idea of what this rule is trying to do? So it's something that is Franciscan, that is biblical, that is fraternal, trying to capture Franciscanism, but in a way that can be applied and discussed and developed in different communities. So that's the only one I've done that for. I've actually looked at the sources, given you the whole one. For the others, I'm just reading through the initial commentary that went to the brothers and sisters when they got the rule. Minority humility. Metanoia leads to involvement with the little ones, marginalized, helpless, unwanted, those in need of various sorts, in the spirit of the Beatitudes, bringing about the kingdom of God. I remember one of the things that impressed me, several things impressed me as we had international students, and you may have a parallel to this, and it sort of brought me to know more about Franciscans International. But because there were Franciscan sisters in several countries, and if you have the case of somebody who's being what we sort of trafficked, really. So you're being taken from one country and you're going to be taken somewhere else for a better life. Sometimes the sisters were able to make sure that they realized their passports could be taken from them. And there were some communities set up with a view to making sure that people would have their recognition legislation. So it was like a bit of an underground network. And I found that really touching. And they said it's because they are not significant. You know, they're not sort of held under such great suspicion. Another, I think it's sad, but this is how it came across to me. There was a time when AIDS was very, very, very rife, often in communities where the men would have to leave, might get into various other relationships, might come back to their country, and AIDS spread not only to the husband, to the wife. There were communities where the sisters became parents because the parents had died of AIDS. So their ministry would be very much helping look after those children. So it's not big, you know, you're up there, you're in a convent, you're all of that, is very much, how do I help the little ones in my area? And of course, they will have been set up because they've seen a need for that work to be done. Work serves those in need and also provides a means for the community to survive. It provides means to give to those in need where workers earn more than is necessary. And the rule says, you know, give excess. What you have in excess, you give away. The community takes an attitude of servanthood that is not judgmental and in a spirit of joyfulness. And that's what I saw. I saw people dealing with very difficult situations and just doing it in joy and in service. Poverty. For Francis and Claire, following Christ meant choosing poverty and living among the poor. Poverty of heart, our powerless to save ourselves and acknowledging God's wills, our salvation. God wants us to return to God. So basically, seeing poverty of heart as putting ourselves totally into the hands of God and seeking God's will in all that we do. And believing that what God desires is that we return to God. God is good, is all good, and we can only claim our limitations and symptoms. This is very much the admonitions. It's throughout Francis' writing, but certainly in the admonitions you get this. Material poverty means depending on God, uncluttered and converted. The helpless poor are closest to God, or can be, I think, but we're looking about a rule for the order. Today, rather than rejecting ownership, the desire is to foster freedom from attachment and proprietary instincts. I remember in my naivety when I started the centre, and I remember thinking, these friars have got so much. They've got their computers, they've got their, you know, what sort of property is this? And it was also a little bit, my first reaction when I would see in Kent, we had a lot of refugees still, as you know, and why do they have mobiles? Some things are really important. Mobiles, a way of keeping you in contact. So when I saw these friars with all this, but basically freedom from attachment. Francis is, well, the lovely Latin, sine proprio. So whatever you have, if you lose it tomorrow, you can cope with that. Without attachment. I don't know whether they did that or not. Who am I to judge? Desire is to be non-judgmental, as judgment belongs to God. So that's all I've done on TOR. I hope it's given you a flavour. I hope just understanding. No good, is it? Understanding why they decided to make it so broad and why they chose what they chose that could be applicable to everyone, and that they chose to do it by going back to the sources with scriptures. Yes, there are other documents and other sources there. And that's how they decided they were going to find their Franciscan roots. And the idea is that as young people come in, and this is the rule that they're going to have, you need to explain to them much more about Francis and Franciscanism to understand it. So it's kind of like a stage, can be used. And I mean, I was asked way back, I think 2003, because Sister Margaret was ill, there was a TOR pilgrimage international, and Margaret was supposed to do the delivery on this, and she was ill. So Paula, would you go to Italy? Would you teach TOR the rule? It's a lovely rule, and I must admit, just exploring it with those sisters from all over the world was a really, really lovely experience. And being able to do it, that was great because you got to places you wouldn't normally get to. It was July, and so my teaching was after mass and prayer was the first input. And where we couldn't have a space, it was teaching out in the open air. So it was really immersed in Francis's place. And it was terrifying, but it was a great joy. And because it is quite short and simple, because I had quite a good knowledge, I could do it. I don't think I'd have been as happy with Memorial Repropository or its equivalent. Anyway, so that's TOR. I feel like you've probably had enough. Without me going on to OFS, can you stand a bit longer? So okay, told you a bit about.
We have a 30-second stand up.
Okay. Question I have, but we know that FMM, we know FMSO, we know FMSJ, we know FMDM, but all of those are congregations. FMM, Franciscan Missionaries of Mary, I believe are still the largest, as far as I know, and Universal group, to the best of my knowledge. But they all take the TOR rule. They will have their own statutes, they will have their own constitutions, but all of them have agreed to take this as their rule. Okay, so now coming to OFS, and I've just taken here, I'm just taking, first of all, a couple of quotations, just to give you some of the flavour of our rule. So, extracts from our rule. Secular Franciscans should seek to encounter the living and active presence of God in their brothers and sisters, in sacred scripture, in the church, and in liturgical activity. United by the vocation as brothers and sisters of penance, let them conform their thoughts and deeds to those of Christ by means of that radical interior change that the gospel calls conversion. That's fundamental. That's one of our, the very first thing we say is that we go from gospel to life, life to gospel, and we seek to follow in the footprints of Francis. But this is the next thing to that. Human nature makes it necessary that this conversion be carried out daily. I remember somebody saying, well, it's a morning, am I going to be a Franciscan just for today? So we're looking at our lives every day. As Jesus was the true worshipper of the Father, so let prayer and contemplation be the soul of all they are and do. By uniting themselves to the redemptive obedience of Jesus, who placed his will in the Father's hands, let them faithfully fulfill the duties proper to their circumstance of life. Let them also follow the poor crucified Christ, witnessing to him even in difficult and persecution. So that's the tone of our rule. Again, at the moment, because we've got the rule centenary for the First Order, all of us in our fraternities are revisiting the rule. And so what you would do, each of these, a bit like the TOR rule, you would spend a day breaking this down and what does it mean to you and the different expressions of it. So it's not quite as basic as the TOR rule, but it's fairly much the tone. You get an idea of the tone. As the Father sees in every person the features of not his sin, and not if. If anyone wants this, please note these correctly. As the Father sees in every person the features of his Son. Secular Franciscans should, with a gentle and courteous spirit, accept all people and those who can't spell as a gift of the Lord and an image of Christ. And I think that's the one that speaks to me almost most. Can I see in other people God? And can I accept them as a gift of God in the image of Christ. A sense of community will make them joyful and ready to place themselves on an equal basis with all people, especially with the lowly, for whom they shall strive to create conditions of life worthy of people redeemed by Christ. Much of our rule is very high ideal, and sometimes we just have to say, this is what we are aspiring, this is the spirit that we hope to have. And so that's all I've given you from the rule. This is one definition. When we do our formation, we have a specific section called charism, mission. The other one's gone from me at the moment. But basically vocation. We link those three together, charism, mission, and vocation. So I often say, whatever group I'm with, if we look at rebuild the house of the Lord and strive for more perfect observance of the gospel according to our state of life and according to Franciscan spirituality, when I start with rebuild or repair the house of the Lord, I always think that starts with where do I live? So anything I do that builds somebody up or is doing something positive, that is rebuilding and restoring. But anything that I do that diminishes from somebody else or ignores somebody else is not rebuilding the house of the Lord. And that's kind of how I summarize what that means. From being flows doing. The fundamental mission of anyone seeking conformity with Christ. So this would be a different aspect of mission, to proclaim Christ, to pass on the urgency of God's love, which we ourselves have discovered and which has changed our lives. To evangelize, meaning to communicate Christ, to bear witness to him, to make him present through our lives and proclamation. So that isn't in our rule, but that would be the kind of thing we would be doing when we have our vocation, mission, charism, looking into other definitions of that. So the SFO is a group of faithfully, this was written before we became OFS, and I haven't changed it. The OFS is a group of faithful, evangelically committed in their secular condition of life for a response in fullness to the call to follow Christ, humble, poor, and crucified as Francis did. Like the other Franciscan orders, it aims to help the church in its mission of salvation, spreading the gospel message of repentance, conversion, and the kingdom. I think that is actually true to every fraternity, because we all have our different ways of experiencing humble, poor, crucified Christ. And I think we spread the gospel by witness. The fraternity is a place where people grow in their Christian faith and understanding of the Franciscan spirit. Members support one another in their individual apostolate. So we are not committed. I feed the homeless, that's one thing I do, but not all of my fraternity do that with me. But I expect support and prayer from the rest of the fraternity in what I do. Somebody else might work in a hospice. So again, what we are doing is we are sharing what we do and praying for one another. We support one another in our individual apostolate, in each member's specific role in repairing the church, and by being ready to respond in any way we can to the needs of the times. The local fraternities is also an encouragement, a place where members can support one another, bound by a true spirit of fraternity. I'm sorry, I did some of this, not correcting it. It's a space where people can share their experience, their faith, and life experiences, and I don't think we do it enough. Ideally, I think gatherings should include, well, I've done it today inadvertently, but I think personal experience should be shared every now and then in the community. And sometimes we just get on with the prayers and the introduction and the business. So that's something I would try and encourage us to do more. It is a space where you can share experience, their faith and life experiences. And that was one of the joys of Assisi, because you were living side by side. I would say 2/3 of us were OFS. the others weren't, but they had a lovely witness, and that was to me living fraternity. Infirm, isolated, and I say, we used to say infirm because we were big fraternities, but now there are many isolated members. I know we've got Zoom, but not everybody can use a computer. So thinking about Lorraine in Jersey, we should be remembered and kept in communication throughout their lives. The OFS is an association of the Christian faithful. It is universal, constituted by the faithful, and directed under the personal authority of the pontiff. So basically, everything we do is under the Pope. As a public association, not a third order, it enjoys the privilege of spiritual and pastoral assistance through the Franciscan First Order TOR and through the Poor Clares as well. Increasingly, we've been I find we've been assisted. Sometimes coming away from the convent, sometimes us going to them. Fraternities are under jurisdiction of the diocese, so that's why we have to still tell the bishop that we are setting up. It is autonomous and united, lives in fullness, its secularity, sharing the common Franciscan mission. And we need to hold on to those characteristics: autonomy, unity, and secularity. And as I said to you early on, that's difficult. It's a work in progress. So what is the role? Ideally, this is what an OFM normally could be: TOR, spiritual assistant, and what I'm now working on giving to local priests to the extent that they can. But particularly with the order, there should be a relationship of equality, complementarity, intimate and reciprocal life-giving communion, mutual assistance, collaboration, enabling an exchange of gifts and experiences between the brothers and sisters to carry out the Franciscan mission entrusted to Francis. So basically, yes, that's a Franciscan, but if you're working with a local priest, you need to give a sense of Franciscan. But when this, the ideal would be always to have a spiritual assistant you could call upon. A relationship of necessity. The Church has entrusted spiritual and pastoral assistance to Franciscans, not the bishop. So we are, again, in that mixed role. In view of fraternity and the solidarity of the mission of the Franciscan family, a relation of obedience and safeguard. So there always has to be someone outside. I don't think it's just true in our church. I think it's true in other churches, to prevent getting into heresy, to be sure that you are keeping faithful. Again, only a Franciscan can do this, but basically, when they come, are you keeping in line? Is what you're doing Franciscan? So the Altus Moderum have the specific role of ensuring fidelity. So you will have visitors, you'll have visitations, you'll have national visitations, you'll have local visitations. Communion with, and you're in communion with the Church, and that you're in union with the Franciscan family. And this is our obedience to the gospel, to the Church, to our conscience, to the rule, rather than to a minister. I mean, we do have ministers, but in our case, mainly it is to the rule. We should finish there because you've come to the time that it should finish. So I will finish there. Okay.
When I began my Franciscan studies, looking back at it, the order was crazy, I was crazy. When I was 23, and which was exciting because it was right at the time all this. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot. The age of Zoom. It was exciting because it was the time of all these discoveries. So my first summer, the critical edition of Francis's writings appeared. So up until 1978, which is when I started, we couldn't say for sure what Francis said. we didn't have a critical edition. And so the wonderful German OFM, Kajetan Esser, after many years of research, came up with the critical edition. It was called the Opuscula. And I remember back in '78, when it was hot off the press, going to the bowels of Freedom in St. Bonaventure's, the Franciscan Institute, the old Father Joseph, who was the bookbinder. And he worked in the bowels of the library, binding books. So I said, Father, could you do me a favor? Could you bind this new book we just got? And so he bound the Opuscula for me. So it's still my go-to, that old Opuscula. And so when I was trained mostly as Friar Minor, though I talked about the brawl we had when the third order scholar came and told the first order scholars they weren't first. So while I was aware of that, I was trained basically in the first order. I had hoped to write about St. Clair, but they made me write, which I'm happy in the end they did, about Anthony of Padua, our first teacher. So I spent over 10 years at the Franciscan Institute in summers, and then I ended up working there and living there and doing some editing and writing. So it's kind of, I sort of grew up almost there as a Franciscan. So when in TSSF, I started doing formation work, and people expected me to say two things, put two things together in a competent way. I thought, well, I read about, I kind of know the third order, but that wasn't really something I had dug into. Now, my academic career was waylaid because of the AIDS epidemic. So I became a founder of the National Franciscan AIDS Network in the States, since we were the Franciscans were the first clergy in a large group to go to serve AIDS patients. And then a Jesuit, a Dominican, and a Marianist came and said, well, what about us? So we changed it from the Lazaro Project, which we named it after the leper hospital of Assisi, to the National Catholic AIDS Network, which really became an international network. And our big work was an annual conference, which in the end, for years, happened at Loyola University, Chicago, where we'd have 300 AIDS ministers from all over the world would gather. And the neat part was we'd have a theologian come and stay with us. And at the end of the conference, give us a reflection on what they had heard. And the year that I was the chairman of the conference, which was my last year with the Roman Communion, my theologian that I worked with was Henri Nouwen. So I was very blessed. So my academic career got derailed. So for 20 years, I worked with people with AIDS, founding clinics and homes. And then once I became an Anglican, then I was head of social services for our diocese and on the board of National Episcopal Community Services, and worked with immigrants, started a emergency shelter for transgendered street kids and a street program in New York, and worked a lot with immigrants, and was our diocesan disaster person during Sandy. So I got off the academic track. So I decided, well, I'm going to turn to my classmate, who I had always been great friends with at Bonaventure's, who had continued her academic and went on to become the first woman to graduate from the Antonianum, and then the first female president and first female director of the Franciscan Institute, the first female president of St. Bonaventure's University, Margaret Carney, who you heard about this morning. So I contacted Margaret, who we had been good friends. She actually made the journey from the wilds of Bonaventure to my ordination, to be a reader of my ordination as a priest. So we went back a long way. I said, Margaret, I'm comfortable that I have a handle on this third order stuff as well as I should if I'm going to be doing what it seems like I'm going to be doing. Would you help me? So she was very gracious, and I was just being hospitable. She was going to cook dinner for me on my arrival, which meant I had to make sure that ate just like this. And as my lecture group will tell you, I'm like, the Sound of Music, how do you solve a problem like Maria? I'm usually running in at the last minute, so I was tearing up New York State to make sure I got to Margaret and her dinner. But she spent a week with me. And that night I arrived, she handed me these 2 big plastic bins. And she said, well, these are all my notes from this process that Paula described in writing the TOR rule. So I had a week of, in the bowels of St. Bonaventure's, furiously photocopying a lot of Margaret's notes and reading a lot and looking up stuff that I was interested in. So in doing that, and somebody asked me, because I made kind of an aside, because I'm always kind of sheepish about it, because I know it can at times be sensitive. I said, well, I think of us, our first order, more like the third order regular. And I'll explain why. In the Franciscan tradition, when you look at the Friars Minor and the Clares, now they're much more, the Clare story is much more confusing between the Ugolino and the Damianites, and those very few actually followed Clare's rule. Some of the reforms, like the Capuchins and the Collatines, would try to go back to them. Most of them followed this other rule. Most of the Clares in the world, what they used to call, I don't know if this would be urbanists, the urbanist Clares. And then you had the Memoriale Propositi and all the foundations. So there were separate rules and sort of separate approaches and emphases that they weren't exactly interchangeable, right? Whereas in the third order regular, which is the regulars were religious, so that's why it's called third order regular, you had the same rule as the seculars, tweaked eventually because they were living in community, but the spiritual roots and the spiritual traditions, the basis in the order of penance was exactly the same. It's the same. There wasn't any distinction, as there would have been between the third order rule and the Friar Minor rule and the Clare rule. So for us, there's no distinction in our root spirituality. Your principles and our principles are basically the same. In the same way, tweaked for the fact that some of us live in community and some of us don't. And in the order of penance, before the church got very hung up on regulating its silos and everything, there was a vast spectrum of religious life among the tertiaries, among the penitents. So you had some people living at home, you had some people living in community, you had some people living in community with the 3 vows, you had some people living in community without the 3 vows, and you had some communities, which will be very similar to TSSF Sangha originally, where you had people living at home in the town and people living outside the town, perhaps, in a community. But both communities had one guardian and were considered one community, which was the original model of TSSF Sangha. There was no difference between those, the big thing who were celibate living together and those who weren't celibate. A lot of the change and stuff came with the influx of Europeans who wanted a much more European sense of that. So that's what I meant when I said I see our relationship more like the third order regular and the third order secular. There isn't the sharp distinction there is between the friars minor and the third order. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying it to belittle the first order, but I think because of our history and that whole thing of where are we in the tree, it can become confusing when we talk in this kind of thing or historically, because the first order in the big tree means something very different than it does for us. It's kind of a, does that make sense? So the other thing that strikes me in America, I had the experience of, at one of our diocesan conventions, of this gentleman coming up to me in a gray robe and cord and saying, "Oh, you're Canon McCarron, aren't you?" And I said, because I usually don't call myself the Very Reverend Canon. But he came up to me and said, "You're, out on the East End, and you're the dean and the blah, 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 it's going on and on." He said, "Well, I'm a Franciscan." And I said, "Oh, really?" And then, so I showed him my ring. He said, "Well," I said, "I'm a Franciscan too. I'm probably part of the oldest, biggest Franciscan community in the Anglican community." And so I think part of our attitude, and that's something we try to address in our formation, I think part of our attitude, there was a long time when we were the only game in town. If you wanted to be an Anglican Franciscan, we were it. And so part of the attitude we found as we were reforming or refounding our formation was that we were almost like the monastic, when the person would bang on the door and the monk would say, "Go away," and so it was kind of like that. You have to prove that you deserve to be a TSSF and jump through these hoops, because we're it. If you want to be a Franciscan, this is it. And this is how we do it. If you don't like it, well, you can go, right?
Amen, brother. Bring it.
But now, as I say, Franciscan communities, at least in the States, are like mushrooms. They're popping up all over the place. There's a joke about two people in a sewing machine, and you can start a religious community. But, so what that does for us is, why should somebody join us when they can be a little sister of St. Clare, a brother of compassion, a companion of Francis and Clare? And I don't even know, I just heard about a new one starting. So then we have to think about, well, what is it that we bring to the table? What is TSF? Why should somebody, I remember as a young Roman Catholic deciding I was going to be a friar minor, much to the chagrin of the Augustinian friars who raised me, and saying, well, do I want to be a conventual or an OFM or a Capuchin? Never having met any of them, actually. And so in a way now, that's what people have to do. They don't have to come to us. So we have to do more of this getting to our sources. And so one of the unique things that we have in this age, especially, at least in the West, and probably in the East to some extent, we have what's being called now an interspiritual foundation. In other words, our principles were not written to be a Franciscan document, right? That was not Jack Winslow's intent. Later, realizing that the Western figure most in sync with them was Francis of Assisi. So after St. Barnabas, who was our first patron, Francis became our second patron, and eventually we identified. But it's kind of like the peace prayer or the prayer of St. Francis, which is not inherently or was not written as a Franciscan document, but it's Franciscan because Franciscans say it's Franciscan. It resonates with who we are. And so it's kind of similar, or some of those phrases like, preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use, which Francis never said. He sort of said that, or the thing Christopher John brought up about the world is our cloister. He never said that. In the Sacrum Commercium, when Lady Poverty asked the brothers, "Show me your cloister," then the brother said, "Look." So our principles are kind of like that, which is fine. So that's why I think we always have the principles in one hand and the Franciscan writings in the other when we do it. But they are eminently, as I hope to show, Franciscan, but in their language and depth, they follow the pattern of Hindu spirituality. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, how they were written and what it means. And you know, the Holy Spirit's always very funny. So today's Lectio is on Bhakti, and that's what I'm going to talk about, is Bhakti, which I think is the way, the first principle, and is part of the solution to our unique, what we bring to the Franciscan table, what is our approach to that Franciscan struggle over the balance between action and contemplation, is this concept of bhakti, which we bring. So now, when I first told this to other mentors in our novice formation program, I don't know if I behave and stand here. I don't want it to squeal. Might keep them awake. So I've kind of entitled this action, the principles, action, and contemplation. What do they, or what did they say? Because they've been adapted. And just like I said, I didn't like the new translation. I don't know. And in getting ready for this past couple of months, I was a very disobedient tertiary, so I did not read our principles every day. I read the first order principles every day. And I used wells, not fences. And so that question comes up in that. Was it a mistake to get rid of bhakti in the principles and substitute prayer, especially with a Western mind? What prayer usually comes down as something you do, not something you are. And bhakti is something you are, not something you do. So I think that was a little tweak. And I understand in the early 30s in England, the idea of having a Sanskrit word probably didn't make sense. But I don't know. But we'll look at that, or I'll talk about it. So in order to bring us back to kind of a sense or a mood or whatever of Christus Eva Sangha, I thought we'd start by doing, now you don't have to sing it, you could sing it yourself, a Sanskrit chant. Now I looked at the chants that they probably would have used, and I'll talk about that. But I mean, for me, they would be above my ability. And I didn't want to throw that at you at this time of the morning. So I'm going to use a simpler Sanskrit chant. And in a way, this brings us back to yesterday, and some of what I said yesterday by, again, another mysterious way, since I hadn't planned on doing this till last night. So this guitarist and singer is Cyprian Concilio. And Cyprian is a great liturgist and composer of liturgical music and music for the office. I happened to see him 2 weeks ago, and he has just been appointed the liturgist and kind of musical curator for the liturgies at the Synod of Synods next month in Rome. so he's on his way to Rome. He also happens to be the prior of the Camaldolese Hermitage. So there we are back. And he's a wonderful guy and a wonderful writer, very spiritual person, who spent several years in India studying spirituality, and especially D. Griffiths, who we'll mention, who was one of the great bridges and formed an ashram, which has always been very successful and is still churning away. And in the end, Bede and the whole community there at the Satchidananda ashram, the ashram of the Holy Trinity, became Camaldolese. So we've kind of gone circle to yesterday. So this is a chant that Cyprian wrote, so it's easier. Somewhat like Teze, Hare Yeshu, Hare Krishna. Hare just means honor, praise, glory to Jesus, to Christ. So you can listen to this. You can, it's very much like a Teze thing. The words are simple. You could sing it. I don't know how this is going to go. And I'm praying that the great God of the internet, it all works. Hare Yeshu, Hare Yeshu, Yeshu Yeshu, Hare Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare Yeshu, Hare Yeshu, Yeshu Yeshu, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Yeshu, Hare Yeshu, Yeshu Yeshu, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Shanti, Shanti, Shanti Om, which is the way that the night prayer book concluded at TSSF Sangha. Shanti, 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 peace, 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 and Om, the universal sound. So, Jack Copley, or John Copley Winslow, aka Jack, I'll probably call him Jack all the time, since I'm getting to know him now. I remember John Hetherington, when he was at our convocation, saying that he will talk about Jack wherever he goes, usually to crickets in response, or blank stares. He asked our convocation, I remember he said, "Who here has heard of Jack Winslow?" I think I raised my hand, and maybe one other person. He wrote the principles we read every day. So we should know, going back to our sources in a way, to some extent, is going back to Jack Winslow. Who was he? Why did he write them? How did he write them? What were the influences in writing them? What are those elements that he put in our principles that are still in our principles? And so I'm not going to do a bio of Jack. Hopefully that's something you can dig around on yourself, or that's something I think I'm going to think more about as I read and get a hold of his books more and get an idea of them. But I'm going to just focus on one aspect of what he gave us. He was a great missioner. And when he writes in his little monograph on TSSF Sangha why he founded TSSF Sangha, what was the purpose of TSSF Sangha? Well, first he talks about a mystical experience he had in England, where he heard a voice almost telling him he was to found an ashram, a Christian ashram in India. But when he says what, and this is getting back to that triple good of the Kamaldabis we talked about, community, solitude, and evangelization. And what's floating around in our circles now of contemplation, community, and missional action, which is very close. He said the main purpose he set out was evangelization. So here you have, and he came and was certainly very familiar with, at that time, the very evangelical mission aspects in India. And they had ashrams, but the evangelical ashrams really were just Bible schools that they called ashrams. But there was also the Christian ashram movement, the TSSF Sangha is a part of, mostly Roman Catholic. And the ones that survived best seem to be the ones that were founded by monastics who already had an idea what they were doing. So Bede Griffith's one had been founded by a French Benedictine who became known as Abhishektananda, who was a beautiful spiritual writer. And then there was another, Jules Monchin, another French Benedictine. And then they asked Bede Griffith, an English Benedictine, originally an Anglican, to take it over. And those ones founded by the monastics, I think because they already had some kind of formation, seem to have done well. But there were Anglican, particularly Anglican attempts at a traditional Indian ashram, which was their form of religious life in India. And TSSF Sangha was one of them. So the life of TSSF Sangha, he writes about, was centered on prayer. And from that prayer would flow their service. So we saw that today in the principles we read of the connection between bhakti or devotion to Christ, which we'll see that's what bhakti means, or the indwelling presence of Christ. And from that flows our service. And so even though it was founded, that was that almost what we said of the Camaldoli's paradox of an order of hermits who see themselves as evangelists. These were an order of prayers who saw themselves as evangelizing. And it was precisely, they saw their life together and their adaptation of Indian forms as, in a utilitarian way, to some extent, the best way to evangelize this very deeply religious culture. It was kind of like the story of Dominic, the founder of the Dominicans, who saw his mission basically preaching against the Cathars, the Albigensians, who had their perfect class, who lived like those apostolic hermits we turned out, extremely poor, owning nothing. And then you look at the Catholic preachers coming with their wagons and big horses and everything. So Dominic said, the only way we can gain legitimacy with these Cathars is if we become as poor and trusting in God as they are perfect. And that's kind of the model for these Christian ashrams. The only way we can reach them when they have these wandering, impoverished holy men and women, the sannyasi, the only way we could reach them is if we can be like that, or that they can understand that. And so that was part of the motivation, but it certainly was the enrichment of some of the ideas of Hinduism and some of the spiritual ideas of Hinduism as well. And so there was a movement within Hinduism called the Bhakti movement, which was a change from maybe what of high, very high Hinduism, where there's no distinction between the individual person and God, and it's kind of this Advaita is what it's called. It's kind of no distinction, very intellectual almost, very via negativa to the point of destruction. And so there was a reaction against that for a personal sense of God, and a God who was in love with the human person. And that the highest form then of life would be giving yourself totally to the love of God, which is what bhakti is, to give yourself totally to the love of God. And so this movement, now I've seen it discussed whether it's chicken or the egg, which came first or who influenced who, between the Bhakti Hindus and the Sufi Muslims, because they came up against each other in India with the Mughal Empire. And certainly if you read Rumi, which is probably the most popular Sufi poet, it's a love poetry. It's a very bhakti. So whether he influenced them or people like him, I don't know. I don't know enough about it to be confident, but there's that connection. So there's this whole movement of bhakti in Hinduism. And when Hindus start embracing the gospel, and they're not happy with what they see as a very intellectual, dry, Western Christianity that's being brought by the European missioners, they see in the Bhakti movement a connection to the love of Christ and to love for Christ and Christ crucified. And so they start Krishna Bhakti, the Bhakti of Christ, rather than the Bhakti of Vishnu or Krishna, the Bhakti of Christ. And so Christians will start, Christians, especially Indian Christians, will start delving into this Bhakti movement. This is Sadhu Singh, who I believe is on the calendar of the Church of England. So he was a very colorful, peripatetic character, where there's a lot of legends about him. There's a lot of fables about him. And at a fitting end for his type of life, he was last seen wandering off to the Himalayas. Nobody knows what happened to him. So he was one of the main leaders, the first great leader of this kind of Christian Bhakti movement, and was very influential. And he made a lot of travels to the West. So this is a picture of him with a Swedish Lutheran bishop, of all things. In Sweden, he went to the States, he came here to the UK, and one of the people who met him and talked with him was Jack Winslow in India. And Jack sought his advice on what should Krista Seva Sangha look like. Because Jack was very much attracted to and filled with this Bhakti movement. And so Sadhu's advice to him, which is kind of interesting, what we saw from James Adderley yesterday, and what we saw at the Hermitage. Jack, in his little monograph on CSS, says, he told me, if we have an ashram, make sure it's not in the city. Put it on the outside, so you won't have all these curiosity seekers coming. And if they have to come to you and want to come to you, they have to really want to come to you. And you're not distracted then from the purpose of being in the ashram in the first place. So when you go to the ashram, you can be in the ashram. And Jack said, well, I always had that in my mind, which is very similar to what we saw of the hermitages. They were not easy to get to. They were not in the middle of town. You had to really want to go there. So that's one influence from a famous person. Another person we're not as familiar with, but was a greater influence on Jack, was Narayan Tilak, who is a Bhakti saint, Christian saint. I don't think he's on any of our calendars, but he might have been one of the greatest Christian Bhakti poets. So many of the bhajans, the songs that were part of the liturgy at Krista Seva Sangha, were written by Tilak. And Jack eventually actually wrote and published a biography of Tilak. So he was a very important figure in Jack's spiritual development and the development of Krista Seva Sangha. And then by kind of whatever, our principles. So our principles come out of this Christian Bhakti movement. And this is a terrible translation, but I didn't have the whatever to tamper with it. It's a bad translation. This is just one of his texts, Tilak's text, which gives you kind of a flavor. Truly, we are friends of people, servants of all people, in their dreams also, their desires. They don't know our other relation. We don't know any other way of being with them. I mean, this is a very bad English translation. Even I can see that. I don't know nothing about Hindi. We are not interested in mean wealth. We consider fame a bubble. We cannot think for even a moment other than the well-being of people. In the well-being of people, a father's care. In the nourishing of people, a mother's care. Nourishing people like nature, like creation. Serving people is serving God. Do not know any other religion but this. So this was TSSF, who's a Bhakti saint, who provided a lot of, now we know also Jack was a liturgist, and I think you sing his hymns much more. We don't sing any of his hymns in the state, but that's something I'm thinking for us. He has a beautiful, I don't remember the name of it, maybe the Brits would know, because I think it's in one of your hymnals, his song on creation. He wrote a beautiful song in praise of creation.
Lord of creation.
Lord of creation.
Lord of
give all
creation.
praise.
Well, there's something the writer of the Principles wrote. Wouldn't a hymn of creation written by the writer of the Principles be a good thing for us to sing? And it's a beautiful hymn. So I'm going to put that to our holy provincials, and maybe that's something our province can include or think of. So that liturgy was also an aspect of Jack that he felt, just like the Christian religion should be presented in a way Indians could understand, since he saw the validity, like Bede will eventually write about, of the Hindu writing about the religious experience, that they should worship in a way they should worship. They can worship, it makes sense to them. So he was the main writer of an Indian liturgy, rather than the use of the 1662 prayer book. So he wrote a Eucharist, which was adapted, and I think is still used in the United Church of India, of the Eucharist. And to much the chagrin of many of the English missionaries and the folks back home. And it reminded me, we talked about Claire kind of saying thanks, but no thanks to a lot of things. That is also part of our story. In a way, Jack did that with the liturgy in India. Made me think of two Capuchin saints, martyrs, with the unfortunate name of Agathangelos and Cashin. And they were missionaries in Ethiopia, way back in the 1600s. And they decided, when they were in Ethiopia, these Copts can't make any sense out of our Latin Mass and the Latin. We're going to use the Coptic liturgy at our mission. Well, when Rome heard this, they were not at all happy. And told in no uncertain terms, Agathangelos, cease and desist. And the reading for their office is their letter of response to Rome, which basically says, well, thank you. We know you're concerned for our spiritual good, but you are sitting in Rome. We are here. So we will continue to use the Coptic liturgy. And so that was some of the response Jack had to give to the reception. So
there's another element to that. I understand that he took that to the Lambeth Conference.
right.
In 1918. Right. So I just think about that. Think about when the liturgical reform started happening in your churches, and that there was the 1662 in 1918. Somehow those bishops said yes to this.
So that's why I think these CSS roots and even Jack is a richness we bring to the Franciscan family, which is kind of unique to us and gives us a certain perspective, which sadly, many of us, when I brought this up in novice class, and one of our mentors is a wonderful person and is totally dedicated to the novices and really is the driving force in our novice class, asked me, well, could you do a little video on the principles? So I did this. Well, he was fit to be tied that I was belittling the principles. And because I was saying, the fact, it's like the peace prayer. Francis didn't write it. And a lot of, I don't know, some, it's probably less, but I think some of our tertiaries think Francis wrote the principles. So it didn't go over big. So I know that some people get twitchy about this or how it sounds, but that's the reality. And it's a gift. It's a gift that we don't know it. So enough of all that. Here's what we looked at today, where he expressed the place of this devotion, this love of God. And we all read it this morning. Bhakti holds, as always, as of right, the foremost place in the lives of the servants of Christ. And that's kind of the Hindu way of talking of religious, is Hindus, which is remarkable because it's also what Francis used. So throughout the admonitions, blessed is that servant, blessed is the servant. And so servants of Christ. And ever deepening devotion to him is the hidden source of all their strength and joy. He is for them the true Bhagavan, the one, the all lovely, the adorable God incarnate, crucified and risen, whose love is the inspiration of service and the reward of sacrifice. So bhakti is a two-way thing. What the bhakti movement taught was, yes, we love God, but God is so in love with us and longs for us that it's a mutual dance we do. So devotion to God is really love of God, loving God. And it's not something you can tick off on a box like, I got morning prayer in. I said my rosary today, or whatever it is. Which is why I'm sorry we went from bhakti to prayer, because in the Western mind, prayer is something you do, kind of. Now, prayer is a part of bhakti, and it's a way of expressing love and bhakti, but it's not bhakti. Bhakti is much deeper and broader, and encompasses all that we do. That word that's in there, Bhagavan, means what the principle lays out. It's the Hindu word for the adorable God, the lovable God, the God in relationship of mutual love and intimacy. That's the goal of the devotee, of the one devoted. Have I lost anybody? Is this making sense? All right. So this is a symbol of the three yogas, which are for us the three ways of service, right? Bhakti, jnana, and karma. So in this depiction, which is a bhakti depiction, the lotus coming out of the mud and blossoming is the karma, or the action. The swan swimming in the waters is jnana, the pursuit of wisdom, which is also different than what we think of it. Yes, it's studied, but they also consider meditation as part of that. So I looked up for some image of jnana, and the image was somebody sitting meditating. So when we see study in our principles, we think it's just, well, I have to get a book, and I sit and I read a book, and it's all up here. But as we'll see when we look at Brother Bonaventure later, that's not even our Franciscan sense. But study incorporates, and the only purpose of study is to grow in bhakti. And so the highest thing, that sun kind of enlightening and brightening everything, is bhakti, which is the goal. So they talk about the ladder of yoga. So these are not all equal. As that original principle says, the primary or the most important one is bhakti. And in a certain sense, the goal of the other two is to come to bhakti. So they're not, and sometimes when we read the principles, it's almost, we say, well, all these three have to be present in the order now. And everyone should practice all three, and everyone's going to have a different emphasis, which is true, but they're all kind of equal. Whereas the original principle really said the idea of bhakti is the main thing. And that's part of, I think, our trouble with our Franciscan form of contemplation action. That all our actions should come out of our contemplation, out of our bhakti, out of our love and union with God.
How do you spell Dhyana in English?
There's all kinds of ways. D-N-A-N-A.
D-N-Y-A-N-Y-A.
That's as good as any.
It's in the bit we're doing tomorrow morning.
Yeah, you'll read about that when I'm not here, so that's good. All right?
Yeah.
So I thought that I am not a Hindu scholar, and I thought it would be good for us to hear about bhakti. So we're going to listen to a Hindu Swami for a couple of minutes, just 3 minutes, talk about bhakti. Now, one of the things that came up in our Lectio group was that if you love God, you don't need to be a scholar. You don't need to be, Brother Giles of Assisi went into St. Bonaventure, the story is, when Bonaventure was up in his room studying or writing or doing things that Bonaventure would do. And Giles looked out the window and saw this old peasant woman hunched over with, I think, a big pack of sticks on her back, trudging along. And he said to Bonaventure, Brother Bonaventure, can that old woman out there love God as well as you? And Bonaventure said, of course. So Giles got up on the window and screamed out of the thing, an old woman can love God as well as Brother Bonaventure. So it's the same thing. So one of the messages is bhakti is actually the easiest path to God because it's love. So again, the internet will listen to our guest for just a few minutes.
To reach the full potential of our human existence, to experience yoga, to experience the union of the individual consciousness with the universal consciousness, the small mind with the big mind. The scriptures say there are different paths of yoga. So there is karma yoga, the path of service and action, jnana yoga, the path of wisdom and knowledge. Another path is bhakti yoga, the path of devotion or divine love. And if you see, out of all these paths, it is said devotion is the easiest and the fastest path. Why? Because to quiet the mind, to focus our whole consciousness, the mind, everything on that one point, that one divinity, that one self or consciousness is not so easy. So through knowledge, settling the mind, making the mind quiet, going past all the cravings and aversions is very difficult. You sit for meditation or you do anything, the mind keeps wandering. It will think, oh, I want to do this, I want to go there, I want to see this. There are so many attractions, so many distractions. So knowledge is not so easy. The path of service, of action also requires a lot of effort, a lot of work. But the path of devotion is effortless. Why? Because that devotion is there, the divine love is there, it attracts the whole mind. The mind has a tendency to run behind what it likes, the biggest pleasure. And that's the problem, it keeps running. But when the goal becomes the biggest attraction, when the goal itself becomes so attractive that everything else just falls off, everything else just becomes tasteless, then the path becomes so effortless, so beautiful. And that is why they say that if you have a master in your life, you're so fortunate because the devotion becomes effortless. It makes it so easy to be established, for the mind to be quiet. And the beauty of a devotee is also that in devotion, there is no ego. The biggest obstacle for that final self-realization is the ego, the sense of difference, the sense of I. But in devotion, where you feel that it is all you, it is all the divine, it is all God, it is all master. In me also, in the other people around me also, then there is no chance for the mind to get distracted, because all it sees, it is only that. All it experiences is only that. And that is why they say that devotion is the easiest path, the most beautiful path, and it's a very, very precious privilege, I would say, blessing to walk that path.
So the easiest path, because love, when you fall in love, it's easy. You don't get up and say, I'm going to be in love today. You're in love, you're in love. And if in that love you see, as they say, God's present everywhere, there is no real distraction. If you live in that awareness of the being enveloped in this love of God and loving God back. So in that sense, it's easy. Now, we also, there's a tendency to think of these three yogas, prayer, work, and service. And this might be very helpful in trying to sort this out, contemplation and action, reaction, contemplation, are three different paths. So this is what some of the yogis say. You can take one, it'll lead you here. You take one, lead you there. It'll take one and lead you there. And we kind of, sometimes when we talk about the three ways of service, have that kind of a sense. And because we think of them as almost just interchangeable, but another illustration I found looking through bhakti and trying to understand bhakti through the yogas was very helpful to me, and hopefully it'll be helpful to you, that there aren't three roads, there's one road. And what some of the yogis have said, if you look at a road, oh, I went back, Charles. A road has three layers. And paddling that idea of a ladder in yoga, rising from action eventually to love, and we would say contemplation. The sub-base of the road is bhakti. The base is jnana, or wisdom, study, and the surface is action. But underneath all of them is bhakti. And so if you take the bhakti out, the road's going to cave in. The foundation running through it all is bhakti. So they're not three separate roads. They're three levels of the same thing. And the three are very interconnected, interwoven. But the base layer, the foundation, or whatever the sub-base course, I guess, is devotion, love of God. So when Christians start talking about this, they definitely see then Christ's love and the love of Christ, right? So I'm going to have a quote from Bede Griffiths. I think Bede and Bede's writings and some of the writings that came out of are helpful in understanding some of this, because Bede is a very good writer, very, very deep, and is writing from the same sense, you could say that Jack had, of the link between these Hindu ideas and our Christian ideas. Oh, I did it again. See, that's just like my life. I always want to go backward. The final stage in spiritual life is to open our hearts in love to this transcendent reality and to find the mystery of love at the heart of our own being. That is our particular calling. For the Hindu, this is the way of bhakti, or devotion, love of a personal God. Opening our hearts in love to the transcendent reality and to find the mystery of that love at the heart of our own being. Now, here's where the fun starts. The seraph is the flaming symbol of love, right? The highest of the ranks of angels. So what does all this bhakti, we're saying this, is it a Franciscan value? I would say very Franciscan. So this angel, the seraph, is particularly the flaming fire of love. It's kind of the furnace of love. And so we have a seraphic father. We are the seraphic order. Saint Bonaventure is the seraphic doctor. The study center, the conventuals, their international study center in Rome is the Seraphicum. So even in our nickname for ourselves, and of course, there's the Seraph of Laverna, right? And Bonaventure will use the 6 wings of the seraph as the framework of the soul's journey into God, right? So in a sense, as the seraphic order, it doesn't mean we're the order of 6-winged angels. It means we're the order of burning love and devotion and bhakti. That the love of God and our embrace of God's love for us, shown in the manifestation of creation and of ourselves and of all things, is who we are. We are the seraphic order. That's what it means. Francis, in this icon, burning with love with the wings of the seraph himself. Another connection is when Francis does talk about the mix of work and prayer in the rule, in the confirmed rule, the later rule, he talks about prayer and devotion as 2 separate things. So he talks about devotion. And devotion is that love, that urge. It's not, I hear sometimes our people information talk about devotional practices, like they're, the 9 points of the rule are these devotional practices. Why don't we just follow the principles? Well, you need to do these devotional practices in order to live the principles, or to find bhakti. I mean, practices, meditation, prayer, fasting, solitude, silence, all those things we talked about are practices to attain true devotion. And Francis talks about them as distinct things. So in the rule, I think it's chapter 5. Put it down, I think it is. Let those brothers to whom the Lord has given the grace of working labor faithfully and devoutly, so that in banishing idleness, the enemy of the soul, they do not extinguish the spirit of holy prayer and devotion, to which all temporal things must be subservient. So what's the important thing? Work, temporal things, Now, this is the one I don't like, the new translation, because it gets a little away from the Latin. I think in the new volume, it says, spirit of prayer and devotion, which all things or all temples should foster. Well, that's much weaker than this. And the Latin word is actually de servire, which means to be enslaved, to be a servant to. So all temporal things, our works, are not to extinguish the spirit of prayer, which all temporal things should be subservient to. That's much truer. So there's not a big difference between this. Don't extinguish the spirit of holy prayer and devotion to which all temporal things must be subservient. And bhakti holds always of right the foremost place in the life of the servants of Christ. Sound very similar. Very similar. The other time he will use this is quoting the rule himself to our first teacher, to my old pal, Anthony of Padua, who I had to live with for a few years. I am pleased, Brother Anthony, my bishop, as he says, that you teach sacred theology to the brothers, provided that, as is contained in the rule, you do not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion during study of this kind. So it also means that the idea of work, which is what this quote is from, is also intellectual pursuits. It's whatever we do. Should not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion, which all other things should be subservient to. And so there is in the Franciscan, in even the idea of theology, that the main thing is increasing devotion. We'll see that very powerfully in Bonaventure. Bonaventure is thought of as is very intellectual. For some of our members, he ruined the order. Like the horrible lines in the very polemic Little Brothers, Little Flowers of St. Francis, where Bonaventure is depicted as a monster who climbs up the tree of the family with great claws and claws at the holy friars. It's pretty wild. But that's been a brush, a taint. That Bonaventure is the prince of mystics. That's his other. And he's all about love. In the Feast of the Sacred Heart, in the Roman Breviary, the reading for the feast in the officer readings or matins is from Bonaventure, writing about the heart of Christ. And in our Franciscan circles, the heart of Christ and that concept of love again has been important in the devotion, the practices of Franciscans. What's the Anglican code word for the Sacred Heart of Jesus? The divine compassion. And what was the first Franciscan community? Divine compassion. Now, Father Joseph, being much more upfront and not caring much what people thought, did not use divine compassion. He used the Sacred Heart. So in our statutes and rules, the chief devotion of the three orders was to the Sacred Heart and the love of Christ. And we see this centrality of love in our history, in our tradition. Now, one of the prayers you'll all be familiar with, which its attribution has always been bounced around. It's Francis, it's Bonaventure, it's pre-Francis, the Absorbiat. What could be more bhakti than this? May the power of your love, Lord Christ, fiery and sweet as honey, so absorb our hearts as to withdraw them from all that is under heaven. Grant that we may be ready to die for love of your love, as you died for love of our love. What could be more bhakti? More roomy, right? And though this at times has been attributed to Bonaventure, it's another one of those things. He probably didn't. I don't know, we'll ever know who really said it. But it certainly had an important place, certainly among Anglican Franciscans, but I think also somewhat in Roman Franciscans as prayer. And so Bonaventure, I actually found a good little synopsis of this thing of Bonaventure on the website of the Catholic Diocese of Melbourne. I guess they have little meditations on the saints for their feast day. And this was, somebody wrote, and there's no attribution, somebody did a great job of putting up Bonaventure on his feast day. And this is what they, we were created to pass beyond ourselves, Bonaventure says, into an ecstasy, ecstatic, rapturous union with the living God. The spiritual life is nothing less than the journey into that union. It all starts with desire. How do we begin this journey? How do we begin to step out of ourselves and go beyond, passing into union with God? The analogy of spousal love is helpful. A couple's union begins with the desire for one another. In the same way, Bonaventure says, we cannot be given over to this ecstasy unless we become inflamed with desires. Now, when you look at 19th century piety and devotio moderna, the idea of being inflamed with desires would be the last thing. You were supposed to be a pious cold fish, right? That was the way. To be inflamed with desires. Bonaventure says, you should be a person of desire. You should be a person of desire. And so when it comes to study and scholarship and intellectual life for the Franciscan, it can't be divorced from this. And so one of my favorite things of Bonaventure is when he talks about in the itinerarium, in the soul journey of God, at the end, he talks about how we pass over into the Lord's Passover. We pass over into God. And he asks, how does this happen? And this is very beautiful. If you ask how such things can occur, seek the answer in God's grace, not in doctrine, in the longing of the will, not in understanding, in the sighs of prayer, not in research, in the bride, seek the bridegroom, not the teacher, God and not man, darkness, not daylight, and look not to the light, but, and this is so beautiful, rather to the raging fire that carries the soul to God with intense fervor and glowing love. The fire is God, and the furnace is in Jerusalem, fired by Christ in the order of his loving passion. Only he understood this, who said, my soul chose hanging and my bones death. Anyone who cherishes this kind of death can see God, for it is certainly true that no man can look upon me and live. So this was the great scholar, the great intellectual. I hear some of our intellectuals railing against, who ruined the Franciscan spirituality, telling us, look for the bridegroom, the teacher. Don't look for understanding. Look for longing. Don't look for doctrine, look for grace. And for those of us who do this, a warning, right? Not research. Isn't this beautiful? And isn't this is an example of bhakti at the heart of action. So when Francis was telling Anthony, yeah, you can teach, but don't extinguish devotion, this is what Bonaventure is exhibiting, right? And so we're going to have another guest This is another one of those things I'm not sure of. Did he really say it or did he not? Maybe Paula might recognize it. It's a prayer said to be by Bonaventure. It has come in some traditions to be prayed before communion because it talks about the bread of the Eucharist, or after communion. But it is, if nothing else, a glowing, fervent example of this love of God and bhakti that Bonaventure is said to have written. So we'll have Brother Bonaventure speak, but in a female voice. I'll wait for Brother David, our good servant of Christ. So you can hear the vocal.
Pierce, O most sweet Lord Jesus, my inmost soul, with the most joyous and healthful wound of thy love, and with true, calm, and most holy apostolic charity, that my soul may ever languish and melt with entire love and longing for thee, may yearn for thee and for thy courts, may long to be dissolved and to be with thee. Grant that my soul may hunger after thee, the bread of angels, the refreshment of holy souls, our daily and supersubstantial bread, having all sweetness and savor and every delightful taste. May my heart ever hunger after and feed upon thee, whom the angels desire to look upon, and may my inmost soul be filled with the sweetness of thy savor. May it ever thirst for thee, the fountain of life, the fountain of wisdom and knowledge, the fountain of eternal light, the torrent of pleasure, the fullness of the house of God. May it ever compass thee, seek thee, find thee, run to thee, come up to thee, meditate on thee, speak of thee, and do all for the praise and glory of thy name, with humility and discretion, with love and delight, with ease and affection, with perseverance to the end. And be thou alone ever my hope, my entire confidence, my riches, my delight, my pleasure, my joy, my rest and tranquility, my peace, my sweetness, my food, my refreshment, my refuge, my help, my wisdom, my portion, my possession, my treasure, in whom may my mind and my heart be ever fixed and firm and rooted immovably. Amen.
I think of Bonaventure rather than by, but I will check. I think of Bonaventure rather than by. Certainly some of the words and imagery, but some died.
Yeah, that's what I
You give me a
thought.
challenge.
There was some
You
doubt.
give me a quest to use the intellect. To use the intellect to find out.
Right. So it's almost like one of Francis's effusive prayers.
Yeah.
Those things just come tumbling out, and that's kind of bhakti. So is this obscure Hindu thing related at all to our Franciscan calling? I'd almost say it's central to our Franciscan calling. So I'm going to end, but I'm going to end with a wish for you. I'm going to read some of you know the work of the writings of John O'Donoghue. Yeah, so I'm going to read one of his blessing prayers, which I think has to do with this, from his book of, is it Blessing the Space Between Us? Right, and this is the blessing of longing, desire. Blessed be the longing that brought you here and quickens your soul with wonder. May you have the courage to listen to the voice of desire that disturbs you when you've settled for something safe. May you have the wisdom to enter generously into your own unease to discover the new direction your longing wants you to take. May the forms of your belonging in love, creativity, and friendship be equal to the grandeur and the call of your soul. May the one you long for you. May your dreams gradually reveal the destination of your desire. May a secret providence guide your thought and nurture your feeling. May your mind inhabit your life with the sureness with which your body inhabits the world. May your heart never be haunted by the ghost structures of old damage. May you come to accept your longing as divine urgency. And may you know the urgency with which God longs for you. May your mind inhabit your life with the sureness with which your body inhabits the world. Shanti, 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 Om. Thank you.